Hey, what is up? This is Jake Hofer with Exodus Trail Cameras. This week's video version of our podcast, Trail Cam Radio, is with Heath Cisco. Heath has been hunting deer since the mid-1980s, and we kind of talk about his evolution as a deer hunter and how from the year 2006, he has killed a solid deer every single year. We talk about how he's finding these deer, what are the tactics he's using, and it's a really good conversation to kind of kick off many people's whitetail seasons or right at the beginning of many others. So we hope you guys enjoy it. He was this last week's guest for Whitetail Cribs. You can watch that with the link below. We hope you guys enjoy it. If you do, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Now let's get in the interview.
Lights,
camera,
follow the trail.
ready to shoot.
If you know where a deer's bedding and you know where he's eating, that deer should be dead.
Camera.
If you're passive on a deer, what you're doing is you're teaching them.
I've got 30 bucks in the Michigan record book. Everyone but one has had at least one previous wound on his body. Some had as many as 4.
Trail Cam Radio from the guys at Exodus.
Okay, we're rolling with another episode of Trail Cam Radio. Today we have the pleasure of sitting down with Heath Cisco. We've known Heath for 3, 4, maybe 5 years.
Maybe 5 years, yeah.
The introduction came from the DeQuistos, so mutual friends there. Heath does a lot of different things with Whitetail Addiction, Logan Custom Gears, done some things with XOP. So he's another guy like Justin Hollinsworth that comes from that DeQuisto lineage. So before we get into too much deeper, any deeper, Heath, give all of our listeners kind of a brief introduction and your background.
Sure. So I started out hunting at a really early age. My dad got me into fishing, took me squirrel hunting, rabbit hunting, and my uncle was a deer hunter, and he was a bow hunter. And back in the late 70s, early 80s, most people, it wasn't very popular. So he killed a buck, and I got to come home from squirrel hunting one day and sit in the back of the truck. And after that, I just couldn't wait to get where I got old enough to deer hunt. So my dad got me a bow probably in 82, 83, and ended up killing my first deer in 83. And it was a deer that was wounded, had been shot during gun season, and I was actually rabbit hunting and jumped him, and he couldn't get too far or whatever. And me being crazy and wanting to kill my first deer, I went back there and tracked the thing down and pretty much put out its misery. But that was my first kill. But after that, I didn't have much success because I was young and couldn't shoot very well, and got into it. So later on in the mid 80s, I got to where I was getting a little bit of accuracy and skill, and sometime around 88, 89, in 88, I decided to. Several of my friends were bow hunters, and they killed some good deer. So I set my goal on a Pope and Young class deer in 88. And then in 89, I was able to successfully kill one, and my hunting's been downhill since then. I've been completely addicted, and I can't wait to get in a tree for the next hunt.
So we just got done with the Whitetail Crib episode here, and we're sitting in your truck room as we record this podcast. So if anyone's listening to the audio version of this, go over and check out his Whitetail Cribs. Look at the incredible body of work, or whitetail resume, I guess, that you've kind of put together. And as we were going through some of these stories, it seemed like there was some success here prior to or around 2006, but then there was a specific point in time that you mentioned in that episode where things changed.
Yes.
And then you've had, basically, you've killed every year since.
Yes.
Every year since. So 13 seasons.
Yes.
You've had 100% success rate, which is, it's crazy. So what, I guess pre-2006, what were you doing, and then what happened where things started to click, or
sure,
what caused that?
So pre-2006, when I first started bow hunting in early 80s, my uncle, he was the one that taught me, and he always went out on the week of Thanksgiving, and that's when he killed his deer. And it was the first decent buck that come through, and he was pretty successful with it. So that's what I did. And then I got to hanging out with some older guys, and they were successful bow hunters. They killed a good bit of big bucks in that time period, and they taught me what I needed to do. You needed to hunt. You needed to set up on a northwest wind. You could only hunt the first week or two of November, and after that, it's just a crapshoot. You're wasting your time. So that's what I started doing, and I had success in '89. I was able to do that. I killed my first buck. I think it was on November the 4th. And it was hunting on a north wind. I had a stand set up in a funnel, and it just worked out, and I killed it. So I thought I had success, so that's what I got to keep doing. And I did that for several years, and I just wasn't having success. And then reading everything I could read in the magazines, and there wasn't TV shows and podcasts and stuff like that back then. So I didn't have the confidence, and I was stagnant. I was killing a deer every 2 or 3 years. And they were hard to find, wouldn't have very many opportunities. And then I just got tired of it. And then around 2006, I thought, you know what, I need to start changing what I'm doing and quit listening to what I'm reading in magazines and listening to what people are telling me. I just need to go hunt. And if the wind is not out of the north, I just need to, and that's what I need. Or if I need a south wind to hunt this deer, well, why can't I hunt it on the north? I'll just get off to the downwind side of where I think he's traveling through and see what happens. And if I blow some deer, I blow some deer. So that's what I did in 2006. And I never hunted in early October because everybody told me you can't hunt in early October. Then I never hunted in late season because they said you'll never get a chance at one in late season. So in 2006, I jumped in. I had a buck that I'd seen a couple times. I knew kind of what he was doing, and I needed a south wind to kill him. And I thought, well, the wind's coming out of the north. I kind of know where he's traveling, and I can hang a set here. And he should travel this way, and I should be on the downwind side of him. So I went in that night, did a hang and hunt, and I killed the buck. And I'm like, this worked. Everything I've been taught prior, reading in magazines and all this stuff, I just did something different, and I was successful. So I started building off of that. The same thing out. I went to Iowa that fall as well, November of 2006, and I went in and scouted. I jumped this buck, and I hung a stand right there where I jumped him. And I thought, well, I jumped him, so he won't come back here for a couple days. So I set up a stand and went back in the next one. I thought, well, who knows, maybe another buck will come back in here, but this is a really good spot. Hung a stand, that same buck come back in the very next morning at 10 after 7, and I killed him. And it was a great buck, and I just been building off that ever since.
Yeah, there's a lot there that I want to dive into. But one of the things, right now it's 2 weeks. We're 2 weeks out from the Ohio opener. Mm-hmm. The thing that you mentioned with guys saying you can't hunt early October, you can't have success in October, you have to wait until the rut. I guess that's kind of the old way of thinking. I think guys are starting to realize that that's kind of a myth. Like there's no such thing as the October lull. Deer are still moving, they're just shifting. Things are changing from what you've observed over the summer. So what, rolling into October, what are the things that you're looking for to kind of signify, okay, it's time to go in and make a move, and I want to go in and kill this deer with purpose? So,
sure.
So,
well, for one, it's locating the deer, and trail cameras have completely changed the game when it comes to that. They make it, they take away a lot of your scouting or whatever, but still, you don't want to get away from boots on the ground. So what I do when I do locate a deer that I have access to, not necessarily have to have a picture of it, but a lot of times that's how I locate them, with cameras. And so once I find one that I want to hunt, I like going in. Now it's 2 weeks before season. This is a time frame that I want to go in and scout that farm. I want to go and put boots on the ground, even if I know it a little bit or I don't. I want to go in and see what's happening. If there's a couple acorn trees over here, are they producing? Is there any white oaks this year? Or if there's no acorns, well, was it our late bean field close by that was planted late and the beans are still green and they're going to stay green for a while? And if I don't have that, what other food sources? Is there an old apple tree in there? I need to see, does it have fruit on it? I need to figure that out. That way the first week of season, I can jump in and take a couple shots at this deer. And if I'm not successful, well, then I'll keep re-scouting and keep moving until I am. And then in some places, some bucks, I get on and I hunt several times throughout October, but I just don't have success. I can't get on them. And if I don't get on them, then I'll plan a little bit towards November. But a specific buck, I want to try to kill him in October or the first couple of days of November, because after that it's just a crapshoot and it could be anywhere.
So 2 weeks before season, you're going in and it sounds like you're scouting food sources. Mm-hmm. You're trying to find food. Is there anything else that you're looking for while you're scouting? I know that everyone's crazy about bedding. Like you gotta hunt buck beds. You gotta find a bed. You gotta kill a deer in its bed or over its bed or whatever. How does that stuff correlate to what you're doing with those food sources?
So I definitely want to know what food sources are available and where the deer are going to be feeding. But I also want to know where they're bedding at as well. But not specifically. If I can find a specific buck's bed, the one I'm looking for, and I can jump and actually see, then that's great. Not that I'll jump right in there and hunt him in early October, because I won't. I'll set back. But if I know there's 3 or 4 oak trees over here producing, and I know he's bedded over here, all I got to do is get in between. And I use the wind and terrain to do that. And then also, like the first couple of days of October, it doesn't really matter, moon or weather or whatever, because they're still in their summer pattern. So you need to jump in and try to take advantage of it. After that first 3 or 4 days, what I'll wait on is a weather change, not necessarily a front, but a weather change, meaning that if you got stagnant weather, like it's just 70, 80 degrees for 4 or 5 days, it seems like the deer get stagnant. What I like is just a weather change, any kind of, whether there's a storm come through. A cold front is awesome, but you don't always have cold fronts. You just have fronts moving through. And I like to go in and hunt the backside of that front. And it seems like the deer are really moving and more active.
Yeah.
Before we get into that, I'd like to back up just from that 2006 moment where you're like, okay, this is what I need to be doing now. What did you find? Because there's still a lot of guys that save their vacation for November. They sit in a rut funnel, and that's the way they hunt.
Mm-hmm.
What did you find was, I don't want to use the word wrong, but just what about that wasn't giving you the success? Like, why did you think, like, oh my, I need to change? What about it was?
So I was not successful is what made me change. So what I found why I wasn't successful, because I was hunting a specific buck. I wanted a certain caliber, and that's what I was doing. That was my desire. So I would go into this farm where this buck, I'm getting pictures of him through, let's say, July, August into October, and maybe, during October time frame, he would kind of, disappear from the camera a while. I knew he was on that farm. My problem was I was setting up and hunting different rut funnels on that farm, but by the time I went in and started hunting them rut funnels, he was 2 farms over. He was locked down with the doe. I mean, I've seen, one of the biggest bucks I've seen from a stand was October the 19th, and it was tending a doe, following a doe, grunting. So some of these older does come in late October, but when you get into November, it's a crapshoot if you're hunting a specific buck. So I started changing up. I wanted to take advantage of bucks that I knew were on their home core area, and I could figure those out and use my hunting skills to be able to set up in those areas. And just getting away from the norm. Everybody's telling you, do it this way. Well, you don't have to listen to that. You keep all that stuff in the back of your mind, but in all actuality, I think people would be better off not to, back in the day, not read any of that stuff. Just go learn it and do it on your own. Now you have podcasts like yours that are bringing all this information out to where people have a big advantage moving in and starting deer hunting than what I had back in the 80s.
100%. Going back to the early season stuff, going in, scouting, kind of knowing those bedding areas, basically scouting those food sources and having an idea of the bedding. You mentioned that you're using wind and terrain to get in between, and you're not really pushing the envelope and hunting those beds. But how do you, when do you know too close is too close and you're too far is too far? Without I kind of know the answer to it, but what's your thought process? What's telling you that, okay, this is where, he's going to show up at last light, I'll have 5 minutes or whatnot? Sure.
So there's a couple different things. For one, you got to make a mistake and learn from it. So that's how you learn. And there's certain areas, I got all this experience, I move in there, but it's still wrong because I got too close. Because every situation is different. A lot of big deer use the same areas, but their circuits are a little bit different. It depends on where the food source and stuff is. But what I like to do is get as close as I can to the bedding area, but be where I can access in and out without the deer alarming the deer. And then using weather, if you can, and moon times. I like overhead and underfoot moon times to where it gets the deer up a little and more active. And if you have that correlated with weather change, some kind of front moving through to where the deer are actually more active, that way it gets them farther from their bed, and I can take advantage of that.
I know every scenario is different, every deer is different, and there's no really shoebox answer there, but I'm going to pry for one anyway. So, you know, in all the success that you've had in those types of setups in the early seasons, if you could give someone a general rule of thumb, is that distance 100 yards from the bedding area? Is it 150? I mean, how far are you typically seeing those deer move from their bedding areas or their beds out into those transition zones or staging areas or food sources in daylight? Like, what's that distance look
Sure.
like for you?
So it really depends on the time of year as well. If the first, let's say, 2.5 weeks to 3 weeks of October, I'll probably probably 2 weeks of October, I'll probably try to stay back around 150 yards. And it just all depends on the terrain features. If he's over the bank or whatever, I could get up more. Or if it's thicker cover where he's at, I can push the envelope a little bit more. But probably it's around 100 to 150 yards. Now, when you get into the late second week, third week, fourth week of October, last week of October, I'll if I haven't had success and I've been bouncing around and it just hasn't happened, well, then that's when I go in and I know that when he comes back to his bed, I'm gonna be able to kill him. So I want to be able to shoot his bed at that time frame. Earlier, it's staying back, trying not to disturb him, and work that process. And if that doesn't work, then you just got to go in and go after it.
So it's safer to say in the early season you're being aggressive, but there's still a sense of caution there until, I guess, a couple weeks before, or maybe the rut, because you know that deer's going to leave the farm pre-rut, and then it's okay. It hasn't happened. It's October 23rd.
Sure. Well, the perfect good example was last year in my Illinois kill. A friend of mine, Justin Hollingsworth, we had this up on camera and knew about him for a couple of years. So Justin was Justin was out there the third week. It was the last week of October, and he had seen this deer come out into the field, and he was hunting field edges because he didn't want to pressure back into the timber. Well, when I got out there, it was on the 28th of October, and I'm like, we know this buck's in this block of timber. Justin hunted the field edges, and he actually, he had some opportunity, but he chose the wrong stand one evening, and the buck walked right by the other. So he was in the game. It just never worked out for him. Luck wasn't on his side. I got out there and thought, I ain't got time to screw around with this. I can hunt this field edge and maybe see him, maybe pick the right stand, or I can just go in there, and if I kind of knew where he was somewhat bedded, but if I go in there and find his bed, there was a weather front coming through, I can jump in there on top of that bed, and I don't have to worry about all this other stuff. He's coming here. And I did that. I moved in on the backside right before the storm. I knew he was moving out into the field around 4:30 to 5 o'clock. I come in on the backside. All the deer had already left and vacated the woods and went out into the fields and was feeding. And I slipped in on the backside, hung a stand. The rainstorm come in that night, washed all my scent away and all that stuff. Then it turned to snow. I climbed up in the stand the next morning, a snowstorm coming in. He comes slipping in, didn't have a clue. And I didn't have to worry about his entry trail and all this stuff out, 50 yards from his bed. I kind of guesstimated and read the sign on where he was coming in and slipped in there, and he come in there. And I knew he was going to this spot, and I killed him.
So why not do that every time? Yeah, that's the ultimate thing. Guys talk about bump and dumps and finding a deer's bed and maybe manipulating that spot. Maybe it's not his bed, but you're manipulating the area. Why not just do that on every deer every time?
So a lot of times the deer's already back there in his bed or within his bedding area vicinity before daylight. And if you go trying to barge in there or slip in there, even an hour before daylight, they're already there. So you can't do that then. And then like in early season, it's hot. The deer get back to their bedding area, and they may feed around that area before they, bed down. So I like getting it to where they're getting their testosterone and stuff's getting up there a little bit. They're more active in making rubs, checking scrapes, scraping and stuff like that. And the further you get towards November, the more aggressive and active these deer are. So I like taking advantage of that to where I try to hunt them on the outskirts, and I'm not saying field edges the first week or two of October. I get back in there a little bit, but I don't press their bed. And it's hard to push a big buck out of his bedding spot as long as he's not getting harassed every day. So I kind of sit back, play that a little bit, and then as I get closer to November, I know that sooner or later he's going to catch a doe and be gone, and I'm not going to have a chance. So that's when I get aggressive. I start moving in. I watch, as we talked before, I like weather fronts. I want something, any advantage is going to keep them on their feet longer. I like overhead and underfoot moon times that's closer to daylight time frames. I go off the moon guide, but I also I throw the moon guide out the window if I got a weather front coming through. And it doesn't have to be a cold front, it just has to be a change of stagnant weather. And I don't like hunting the front end of that weather front as much as I do the back end of it.
Do you take the barometer in consideration with that?
Well, with the fronts, the barometer completely comes into play because when you got a front coming through, you got a low pressure. Then as soon as that low pressure blows out, you got that high pressure that comes through on the barometer. So that's exactly what I'm doing, but I'm not saying, okay, I only hunt with the barometers where it's 30.3 or whatever. I'm using that weather change. I could care less what it says, but if you read it on the successful days and right after a weather front comes through, it's usually high anyways.
True.
So as we've talked here for 20 minutes or so, you've brought up weather and the moon a few different times.
Sure.
And those are two things I want to dive into a little bit deeper. Let's start with the weather because I think that's a little less subjective. I think there's a lot more people on the same page with the weather. So when we were recording the Whitetail Crib episode, or maybe it was even when we were just BSing before we started recording, you mentioned about hunting the first south wind after a weather front. Not necessarily a cold front, but the first south wind after a front. So what is that exactly?
So, in my opinion, it's a weather change from the norm of what it's been over the last few days. Let's say a weather front comes through. A lot of times they come through from the north, and I like when the weather changes, and I like when the wind direction changes. Sometimes it's not really from let's say a rainstorm or something comes through. It's just the weather changes from the north to the south because of the fronts. It's happening out west, it's moving across, and it changes kind of the jet stream or weather movement. I'm not 100% sure why. I assume that the deer is just a stagnant weather change, and I've had great success, though, when a weather switches from the north to the south. So a lot of times it's after a weather front, but most of the times the weather's from the north. But then when you have that change, and especially with that change correlates with a high pressure day, the deer seem like they're just very active. And that's what I found over the years. And it could even be from a south to a north, you know what I mean? A weather change like that. But most of my successes came on a north to a south change.
Do you think that's because it's such a drastic change and it's not like from a north to a northwest or like a south to a southeast, and it's just like a 180 degree change from the weather's out of the north, and then all of a sudden it's out of the south?
I think so. Like I said, I think the deer, move on weather changes and in stagnant periods. Like, if you have a week of south winds, and then you have a little bit of a front come through, and the wind changes to the north for 4 or 5 days. That first day of that change, it seems like it's great. It's the same way with the south. If the wind's coming out of the north for a week, 3 or 4 days or whatever, and then it first changes to that south, that's when I have a lot of my success. And I'm hunting the whole time period. So going into that, let's say when it is the north, it just seems like it's, if you get it on the first couple days, you have the deer real active, but the farther you go through that, it seems like they become less active. And then when it switches and changes, it seems like, to me, it makes them more active. And why it does, I think they like weather changes. It's just like, I think anything, it's the same with fishing. Fishing, if you just got stagnant weather, the fish seems stagnant. But if you get some kind of front, or if you throw in like an overhead or underfoot moon time, and you correlate that with prime deer movement times, it seems like they get more active. And all I'm looking for is something to move them another 50 yards. That's all I'm really, I say active. It doesn't mean that they're running around like crazy. I'm just trying to get them farther away from their bedding area in the evening, or I'm trying to keep them active more out there feeding in the morning. That way I can slip in on their bedding and have 2 or 3 minute time period to where they're just a little bit farther away and they work back in to where I can take advantage of it.
I think that's the most important point there, is that you're not trying to get these deer to move a half a mile in daylight. It's just a couple minutes, it's just a few yards, the difference between killing a deer and not killing a deer. Is there anything else on the weather? We mentioned the change of wind. A couple weeks ago, there was we did a podcast with a guy in Michigan, and you hear a lot about guys setting stands up or trying to hunt a deer on a specific wind, and like if they can't hunt that wind, then they can't get into that piece of ground or can't hunt that deer, as you kind of alluded to some of that to earlier. But this specific guy, he would watch for east winds, which are kind of rare.
Yeah, kind of rare.
I mean, typically you have a coastal storm, right, coming
Yes.
up the east coast, and we'll get a southeast or an east wind, but
Yes.
it's typically pretty rare. Do you have an opinion on those rare winds, like non-predominant winds that deer are not used to, and how that affects movement? Have you seen anything kind of out of the ordinary?
I don't know if it's set in my mind, but it seems like east winds to me it just doesn't work out very well for hunting. And I've always, my dad was a fisherman, so growing up, west is the best, east is the least. I mean, for fishing. So, and you kind of found that, fishing on the Great Lakes up there, Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie and stuff. But deer hunting, I've kind of found the same way. East, it seems like that's odd wind, so I don't have a lot of setups, let's say, for that. But then, as you spoke earlier about guys having certain farms that, I can only hunt this farm on a north wind, or I can only hunt this farm on a south wind. In my opinion, they're hindering themselves because there's always a way to get on that deer, no matter what wind it is, even if it is an east wind. But you may not get away. It won't be a perfect setup, but all you're looking for is to kill that particular deer. If you get winded or found by other deer, if you dive in, being mobile, dive into that set, and you do get noticed by a couple other deer, you're only trying to kill that one. And you got to take advantage of him. So if he's moving through this certain circuit, you get on the downwind side of it, and even if you can't kill him until he's downwind of you, by that time he should have an arrow going through him. So the wind doesn't have to be perfect. That was one of the things, as we talked about prior to 2006, everything had to be perfect in my mind, because that's what I was taught. But it doesn't have to be. It has to be perfect in that moment of time when that arrow is going to it. And once it's released, if that wind gusts around or he's in your wind, it doesn't matter.
Let's talk about that a little bit deeper.
Mm-hmm.
Wind and your setups and how you're setting up based on the wind. We'll call this Southern Ohio, I guess, in hill country.
Sure.
Mixed ag, wind, it does goofy things in hills.
Yes.
Or in mountain terrain. So what are some of the things that you're doing to monitor the wind, to know what the wind is doing, to know where your scent cone is going, to know how the deer are using the wind?
Sure. So, like I said, if I can find out where they're bedding and find out where they're feeding, I kind of can figure out their travel route, at least narrow it down. And it depends on what time of year it is. If it's early season, it's humid, the heat's kind of up, and you got all this foliage, the wind's going to do one thing. Compared to late October, early November, when a lot of the foliage is gone, the temperatures are cooler, and let's say you have a harder wind or a lighter wind. So each one of my setups, I try to, which is kind of scary to predict the weather, because the weatherman has screwed me over on more hunts than anything. But I used to think that it was the weatherman's fault on why this stand didn't work. What I found out as I went along, it's more of the thermals and the lay of the land on why that stand didn't work. So you learn, and each setup is different, but you just try to think of it as Gene Winslow said way back in the day. You try to look at the wind as water flowing down some over top of rocks. I kind of play that in my mind, but then certain areas you find, I always take milkweed in with me when I'm setting up a stand. But I try to look at the following day when I'm actually going to hunt, or that evening, depends on what I'm doing. Wind speed is very, very important. Certain areas I like a higher wind speed. Other areas I like a calmer wind speed. That way I can play the thermals more. Because if you got a higher wind speed, the thermals may be harder in certain areas, but not even have an effect in others. And then the foliage you got to play into it. Open areas inside the woods. I hunted a farm out in Illinois there a couple years ago, to where the bush honeysuckle was horrible, and I was hunting these pockets. But what I found I was getting busted every time I hunted those pockets. The wind was coming over top of the bush honeysuckle when it was tumbling in them open areas. And so I'm sitting up on the downwind of this open area, and the deer winded me on the upper end because it was tumbling. So so what I had to do is I had to start hunting more on the edges and stuff, and then I wanted a lighter wind speed. That way I could hunt along the edges more, and I could use the draws and stuff to either pull my scent down in the evening, or the high pressure day to where it was going to be a sunny day and it was cool at night. So when it becomes daylight, as soon as you get that shift around daylight, the thermals, as soon as the sun pops up, the thermals start sucking your scent up. Used to when I first started hunting, I never understood. I would set up on a northwest wind, and everything was perfect. Then right at when the sun raised, it seemed like it got really cold, and the weather and the wind changed. And I'm like, what in the heck is going on? Well, all it was is that sun shining on these hills and kicking in the thermals for a short time period. And then after half an hour or so, my wind would go back to normal. So you start kind of playing that a little bit.
So there's a couple things there. One is there any way to figure all that out without screwing up and learning from it?
Absolutely not. I mean, you just can't read a book or listen to podcasts to completely understand it. You take all that information and you build off of it. You got to use your mind a little bit too. You just can't, like I was always told, what works for me may not work for you. But you have to get out there. You have to screw it up. You have to, as Andre DeQuisto told me several years ago, fear of failure is a whitetail hunter's worst enemy. Don't be scared. If you go in and screw something up, then you screw it up. Move on to the next opportunity. But if you only have one farm and 2 stands on that farm, if you screw it up, well, then you probably screwed up your farm. But don't be that guy who only sets in 2 spots. Try to find other properties. Don't just hunt those 2 spots. Move around a little bit, because more than likely, if you hunt those 2 spots a couple different times, the deer are on to you anyways, or at least the buck that you're after. So move around, be mobile, try different things and learn from it. Okay, and it's good to keep a log too. If I go out and hunt this one spot, and what did the wind do that day? Was it overcast? How many miles an hour was the wind? Was it 15 to 20 mile an hour, or was it light and variable? Some spots used to, prior to 2006, I didn't want to hunt. If it was light and variable, I wouldn't even go hunting, because it shifted back and forth. But man, I like that now, because all I got to do is play these thermals. If it's light and variable with the sun coming out, I know exactly what the wind's going to be doing, because where my setups are, it's not going to be light and variable. It's going to be light, and it's going to be sucking down that draw from in the evening, because it's evening thermals, or it's going to be lifting up if we have a bright sunny day. If it's overcast, it's completely different. The thermals aren't as strong. So you just got to play that, and each situation is different. But either if you can't remember it in your mind, log it down on paper. Mm-hmm. So it depends on if there's foliage on. If it's November, what the temperature is, or if it's late season. Yeah, it's completely different.
In hill country, a lot of guys get consumed with we'll call it nighttime sign stuff, like maybe down in the bottoms or up on the very ridge tops, and a lot of times I find that you can't hunt a lot of bottoms, at least in the areas that I'm in. They're super, super narrow, super, super tight, and depending on what the wind's doing, it just swirls.
Yes.
You're getting either a tumble effect, or it's wrapping around a bowl and it's doing
yes.
Horizontal. Is there ever a time where you can go in and hunt those bottoms?
In my opinion, yes. You gotta pay attention to what's happening down there. But when you go in, you need to have a pre-hung set, and you're only talking about a 15 to 20 minute hunt. You slip in there right. If you're getting, let's say you got a scrape at the bottom, and a lot of these. I don't know what the actual term is for them, but a lot of times these bucks make their scrapes and have a lot of rutting activity in the early morning or late evening. The late evening is when I like hunting those bottoms. It's the thermals all drop down into there. It's like a thermal hub. They're down there and they can smell they can pick a doe out and know which ditch to go up. What I like doing in those situations is you can't hardly get in there in the morning and have that happen. I like to be up on a ridge around that area with my scent lifting up on a high pressure day to hunt them and catch them coming out of those bottoms, because they're down there before daylight and you can't get in on them. So what I do in the evening is have a pre-hung set, and if that buck's coming down there, let's say at 5 o'clock or 10 to 15 minutes before dark, well, what I'll do is I'll slip in 15 minutes before that. I'll slip in there, get the wind in the best advantage that I could get. If there's a higher wind that day, I want an open area in behind me. That way the wind travels across that kind of thermal hub and carries out. I try to go in and get in there just minutes. You're going to have a short hunt. So don't sit down there for 2 hours. waiting on the deer to get ready to move down in there where they're already busting you because your scent's swirling around everywhere. Jump in there really quick for a quick hunt, get up in your tree as fast as you can, slip in there. Hopefully you kind of got an idea on where he's bedded, and slip in there on the backside, climb up in your stand, get set up, and have you a 15-minute hunt. And sometimes it could be phenomenal because they'll come in, your scent hasn't had a chance to churn and completely contaminate the whole area, and they come strolling in there. Now they may bust you, but hopefully you got an arrow in before then. If not, you might as well just cancel that spot and set back and wait to catch him on one of the ridges.
So in a scenario like that, is stand height, is that affecting how long you're going to be sitting there, or affecting what your thermals or what you're doing there on that set?
So normally in the evening, it's like a pool. Your scent follows down in there and then it kind of fills up. I like getting high. That way, if it's filling up, that means it's rising just a little bit. So get as high as you can and take advantage of that. And like I said, in the evening, usually if I'm hunting out on one of them ridges and stuff, I like to kind of get low because your scent's pulling down anyways. So I kind of get off to the side in one of them ditches where I'm hunting or whatever, where my wind's kind of pulling back. And it could be blowing your wind could be, let's say, a south, and I'm set up to hunt a north wind. But it's a calm day. It's a calm evening, and my scent is going to be the wind direction is going to be overpowered by the thermals, and I get in there and take advantage of that to where it's sucking down that ditch instead of blowing across that flat that I'm hunting, let's say. So it's tricky. So
yeah, there's a lot there, and it's one of those things that, as you mentioned, it's not. I don't know that you could just read about it or listen to a podcast or watch a YouTube video without actually physically going out and trying to see, because if you're on water, it's different. The steepness or grade of the banks that you're on it's going to be different.
Yeah.
The
you throw in wind speed, overcast, sun. It's just. But if you can't remember all that stuff, take a log and say, well, in this situation, this is what the wind did. Well, in this situation, this is what the wind did, and keep track of like barometric pressure because the scent's everything's rising or whatever. Overcast, it's kind of a stagnant day. Everything's kind of settling and going down with the thermals. And each situation is different. And once you do that for a couple years, you'll start figuring out that, man, I can hunt these spots when the wind says it's completely wrong. I can get in there and try that here. And if you blow it, you just move on. I mean, it's not like it's the end of the world. Normally that buck will shy away from that spot but take advantage of him in another spot. Because if he's shying away from that spot, he's going somewhere.
Right.
They're out there all the time. So it's not like, I'm just not going to hunt today because of X. They're still there. They may not move as far, but guess what? A coyote may jump him up and push him right by you. You just don't know.
Right. And I guess to wrap some more context around what we're talking about here, these types of wind and thermal scenarios, these aren't all day sits, because this stuff changes throughout the day. The thermals will do something different in the morning versus the evening versus the day. There's a stabilization period there as wind speed increases throughout the day or changes. So that's one important thing I want to mention. That these are probably in a morning or an evening type strategy based on thermals or based on.
Yes, absolutely. And then there's certain places that I may not go into till, it depends on time of year, till 8 o'clock, till the actual thermals actually start working. Because if I try to get in there early, like before daylight, the wind's pulling down the hill, and that's kind of where the deer are. Well, I may not slip into this spot, especially if it's later on in October, beginning of November. I may not slip into it till 8 o'clock. Let them thermals kick in and start going, then jump in there, and then deer don't have a clue because they're down there at the bottom of the hill. In these bottoms, they're taking in all this stuff, the bucks are or whatever, and then he may jack around down there and be caught up with the doe or who knows what, and he feels comfortable with everything that he smelled. Then as soon as them thermals switch, I may be over here and jump over into that. I may hunt another stand and then slip into that stand, after like 8 o'clock when the sun comes out and the thermals start working. And they come strolling up there and don't have it. They feel comfortable because they got all that scent in the morning. Then when that thermal switches, I jump in there, and then they're strolling up through there like they know they feel confident, and they don't have a clue.
So what does a set like that look like? I mean those late morning entries or access, you're trying to catch that deer coming back to bed late. Mm-hmm. Is that a pre-rut strategy?
It needs to be more towards in my opinion, more towards the last week of October to the first, through any time in November, let's say. You want them to be active. And even in late November, if they're active down in this bottom, let's say, and they're making all these scrapes and they're checking all these scrapes down there in the bottom, and I can't, maybe I haven't jumped down there and tried an evening set yet, as I talked to previous, but I need to set back and I know where they're coming up this ridge or whatever. But if I set there before daylight, my scent's going to be sucking right down there to them. So what I'll do is, that kind of situation, you got a bottom area where there's a lot of rutting activity and there's some big ridges coming up, and I know if I set in this travel corridor, or let's say funnel, that where they come up through there and travel, if I'm setting there before daylight, they're going to get my scent because of the way the thermals are. I wait till it switches, then I slip in there as quick as I can. I may be 100 yards off in another stand, and I'll hunt there like before daylight. And then I hunt there for the first hour or whatever. And as soon as I sense that sun's as soon as I see that sun's starting to change and come up, and I can feel the wind shift a little bit, I'll pack my crap up and just get there as quick as I can and jump up in that tree and, and take advantage of it. So this buck that thinks that everything's in the clear from what he's done, he comes strolling up there and doesn't have a clue.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I've heard guys talk about moving elevations or whatnot throughout the day, depending on what the thermal's doing.
It's the same concept.
Right.
Yeah, it's the same concept.
Right. Okay, so now we're going to get into a pretty debatable topic. It's one of the things that we've been talking about a lot lately on our podcast, and it's things that we talk, Cameron and I and Jake and Jason, and we talk about it in the office, and no one really has a hard opinion on it, and that's the moon. We just did a Thursday threshold maybe a month or two ago on the moon. I know, you guys, and I want to say you guys as, Andre, Cody, yourself, Justin, big believers in the moon.
Sure.
So, what is it? What's your opinion on the moon? How does it affect your movement?
So, like I told you, my dad was a fisherman way back in the day, and I become a fisherman and knew that certain moon times, especially the overhead underfoot times, the fish seemed like they turned on. It's the same way the fish turned on with a weather front coming through. Right before the front, it seems like you had a flurry of the fish biting, and then right after the front, you had a flurry of fish biting. But during the main storm, it wasn't that much. So I knew that going into it. Then when this Jeff Murray come out with the moonbeams and the moon guide, and he had several videos, and in his book he interviewed Miles Keller, and I was a big fan of Miles Keller because he was killing Pope and Young class deer back before hardly anybody. So I read the book. I didn't quite understand it as much, and I started applying the moon guide, and I wasn't having a lot of success in the beginning. So what I found was over time is the reason I wasn't having success is because of where my stand placements were. So this moon, in my opinion, the overhead and underfoot times, and then the red moon are going to keep these deer on their feet a little longer than normal. And all you're looking for is minutes to keep these deer more active, either getting back to their bed or in the evening when they're on their feet earlier and they're going to move another 50 yards away from their bedding area. So using those moon times, the overhead and underfoot, and following along with the red moon times, it seems like it keeps them, it makes them more active. So, and also the weather does the exact same thing. So the moon is great, but weather trumps the moon. So if you got a weather change coming through, I don't care if the moon guide says it's the most horrible time in the world to hunt. If you got a weather front, you need to get out there and hunt. Right. Either, and it's hard to catch it on the front side of the weather front because usually the deer know it way before you do because the pressure changes and all that kinds of stuff. It's kind of like a dog. Dogs know that a storm's coming in if you got a dog that's scared of storms. And then I like when I hunt in the second, third week of October when I'm wanting to hunt big buck bedding. I want a moon time, overhead moon time. I want the moon moving in the sky. It seems like it makes the most active deer movement. But I want a moon time to where that moon is directly overhead or directly underfoot within the first hour or so of daylight. It seems like it keeps them more active. What I found, and listening to other hunters, if you go in there to where the moon time is, let's say at noon, where it's going to be directly overhead, if you try slipping in bedding areas at that point in time, a lot of times you bump them out when you go in. You can hear deer run off. They're back to their bedding areas before that. Same way in the evenings. If it's a stagnant weather period and you're pushing close to that big buck's bedding area, you may see him, but he never gets to you. And a lot of times you don't even see him. But if you have that overhead moon or underfoot moon that's closer towards that evening time frame, it gets them more active, it gets them moving, and hopefully they can make it that other 40 to 50 yards to you.
So when we're talking, excuse me, overhead, underfoot, moon is high in the sky, directly overhead. So if anybody hears that term, that's what we're talking about. Underfoot is the exact opposite.
Yes.
It's completely underneath of your feet at that point in time.
Yes.
180 degrees, polar opposite of that being overhead. And you know, if you're interested in looking at that, I always refer to the transit times or the rise in the set, which you can find on any weather app, or you know, and then you just kind of divide that by 2, find
Yes.
you know,
Your longitude, latitude, and then go from there.
Exactly. So, you know, weather trumps moon. I think we're all on the same page here. But is there anything to moon phase? Because again, this is something that we talk to a lot of guys. Some guys are moon phase guys. Sometimes it's the new moon. Sometimes it's the full moon. You know, we interviewed Justin a few weeks ago, and his thing is plus or minus 4 days of the full moon. So he's hunting morning or hunting evenings, and he's hunting mornings. Is there anything?
So I like going off of that too. I completely agree with what Justin says. You know, about the before a full moon, the evening times seem a little bit better, and after a full moon, the morning times. You know, when I first prior to 2006, when I was one track minded on what everybody told me, you know, I always thought hunting was best on overcast days because the deer thought it was kind of dark and they would move more. And then I also thought, you know, full moon is a horrible time to hunt because the deer just don't move. They're up running all night because it's like daytime, and then they're bedding all day. What I found is it couldn't be any further from the truth. The darker the moon, a lot of times it seems like the movement is more suppressed. And why, I'm not 100% sure, but that's what I found. And talking to other hunters, that's what they found as well. So full moon, especially, like it says, it's mainly the moon is moving in the sky. So a full moon, you know, it's up more and stuff in the evening, and it gets the deer. It's the gravitational pull that actually gets everything happening. It's the same way with fishing. It's the same way with deer. It may not be as drastic as people want to think. Okay, the moon time says it's at 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, at 8 o'clock, deer's just going to come out of the woodwork. Well, they may, but you may be in a position to where, in a stand position where you don't see that movement. So what I found is using the moon guide and looking at the overhead and underfoot and the actual red moon times, which a lot of correlate with the full moon, the days before and the days after. You got to position yourself in the right spot, and the deer are going to be more active. And I know, talking to Andre, the positions and stuff, the places he hunts, I mean, it's almost like a light switch. He said it's so on the money, it's crazy, you know, in the places where he hunts.
So, weather trumps moon, but is there ever a time where you get a transit time, overhead, underfoot, maybe it's full moon, plus or minus 3 to 4 days. Is there ever a time where you're on a deer, he's on maybe the cusp, does the moon trigger you to go in and make a move and attempt to kill him?
Sure. So I'll get more aggressive with an overhead or underfoot moon closer to prime times. I'll get more aggressive, let's say in an evening, 3 or 4 days prior to the full moon. I'll get more aggressive in the morning, 3 or 4 days after a full moon. Now, that's because of what I've experienced in the woods and from talking to people. And a lot of people, they get in their mind that this is the time you got to hunt, and they start hunting that time and they're successful. So they don't think any other time is good for hunting because they're concentrating on that one time. You got to hunt all these other times to start marking them off your checklist because you didn't have much success. But then again, it could be from a coon hunter went through that night. And I go in there in a perfect morning, the moon time's right, the weather's right, it's the first south wind after a north as we talked, and I still don't see anything. Well, I'm either in the wrong spot or something happened, and you find out that coyotes blew the deer out of their spot before then, or a coon hunter was in there the night before. So you can't just take one hunt and make a determination on all that stuff. You take years of gathering and collecting data and moving to different spots to come to your conclusion. And I've come to the conclusion that I like the moon times overhead and underfoot. I go off of the red moon times, whatever. I don't completely plan my hunt on it. It's a time of year too. I mean, no matter what, The first 2 weeks of November are great hunting. I don't care what anything is. If the weather is, if the weather is warm, it's still going to be great hunting, but it's still going to be good hunting, but it's not going to be great hunting. But you add a cold temperature drop the first week of November, the deer are going to be going crazy no matter what. And you get into the 13th, 14th, and 15th, a lot of them's going to be locked down, and the does are going to get bred. So you just play that, but then you throw in a weather front, or you throw in a red moon time for that. It just increases your chances because it keeps these deer moving more.
So I have two questions. When you're talking about the full moon and the new moon being dark and being bright, does cloud cover affect that? Or is it the moon phase, or is it the light illumination? Is it deer are more active at night because there's the full moon, or is it because it's bright?
So, in my opinion, I don't think it's either. I think it's a gravitational pull
So it's
from.
not the light illumination. It could be cloudy, but it's still a full moon. It's dark at night, but it's a full moon.
Like you said, if it's a full moon, it's cloudy and overcast. It's not really a full moon,
Right.
For brightness or whatever. So I think it's more the gravitational pull and the time frame of what leads into that, and then you take the weather in top of, and all that. And like I said, weather trumps the moon. So I would completely throw the moon guide out the window if I had weather changes every 3 or 4 days. I would just hunt off the weather changes. But then again, you have stagnant periods to where you need other forces to move these deer. So you go off the moon guide. But you still hunt. If you got an opportunity to hunt, with busy schedules and stuff, you hunt as much as you can. But maybe take more chances, maybe go into your better spots, maybe get more aggressive when the moon kind of tells you that deer should be on their feet more.
So with the overhead and underfoot, I think there's a couple things there that I want to pry into a little bit deeper. One is when it seems like you're using those transit times or overhead underfoot times to hunt closer to bedding, whether that's in the morning or the evenings. Is there a difference that you've seen? Like, let's play a scenario out. You're going in the morning. Like, let's go back to that the buck that you killed in Illinois last year. You snuck in on the backside.
Yes.
Killed that deer in his bedding area. Have you seen a difference in movement on an overhead moon versus an underfoot moon?
So I like an overhead better than I do underfoot. I mean, and I can't really say it could just be in my mind, but I do think what I've experienced, I've had more luck with for my logs or whatever, I've had more luck with an overhead. I've seen more activity with an overhead moon. And I'm not saying that an underfoot is bad. I like them either, but it seems like my success, I've had better success with an overhead.
So with that moon being overhead or underfoot, is there like with an overhead moon, would you prefer to hunt a morning over an evening? Or if the moon was underfoot, would you prefer to hunt an evening over a morning? Or what is?
It completely depends on the time of year and the buck I'm after and where he's at. Like for instance, if I'm struggling to get on this deer and I've bounced around and haven't had much success, but I know where he's bedded at, the area he's bedded at. If I could have that in the morning and I could go in there, let's say the day before, and bust him out of there, do a light bump out of there and then hang a stand. If it's late October, and then hang a stand and have that moon like that and first thing in the morning, that's because I'm pretty much guaranteed that he's coming back to that spot. If I'm hunting an evening, I'm kind of guessing he's going to take this circuit or that one or this one. So you don't want to make that aggressive move at the beginning of season, but you have to make that aggressive move, in my opinion, when it starts pushing towards late October. You just have to. If not, you're just going to be sitting back hunting a ghost before long because he's going to be 2 farms over with a doe or something.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So I want to go back to the red moon and the red moon times. What is the red? Like, is the red moon a phase, and why is the red moon so significant that there's an app built after it?
Sure. I think it goes on the phases because that's how this whole moon thing works. But it goes on the times when the rising moon, or the overhead moon and underfoot moon are closer towards the prime deer movement activities.
Oh, so it's just the transit times.
It's more in my opinion, it's more the transit. What I'm getting out of it is more the transit times. But but if you follow that, when the moon is overhead and underfoot in those times, it's usually prior to full moon, after full moon. During the dark of the full moon, the transit times are all jacked up. So for hunting purposes, so.
And I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but when you're looking at like the Farmer's Almanac or like these fishing forecasts, there's like a primary time and then there's a secondary time, and typically that lines up geographically where you are in the country or the world. That primary time is usually the overhead, and then the secondary is usually your underfoot.
Sure.
So
yes. And that's when my dad always had Farmer's Almanac calendar, and when we would plan our fishing trips or whatever, he would try to plan it around the calendar. We started looking into it more, and it's exactly what you said. So then when the moon guide come out, I was like, I read it and it made sense. So, but it took me a while. It isn't going to happen overnight. Don't just try it a couple times and throw it out the window. You got to keep building on it. You got to be in the right spot.
Yeah. What about? I know you guys you're doing a lot of things with cameras. Is there any trail camera data that you're looking back on and referencing that movement, or those daylight pictures to the moon? Like, oh man, on the 17th of or 18th of October. 6 different cameras have 6 different bucks show up all 5 minutes earlier than
and I have noticed that a lot of times I don't place my cameras in spots that you could pinpoint that. I put them out more towards the edge of fields, maybe on one of those bottom scrapes we talked about. I have noticed that a little bit, but anybody who runs cell cameras, watch those cell cameras and you get immediate data, and you can correlate that data with the weather outside has increased my thoughts and knowledge on hunting weather fronts and moon times more than anything. Because if you go pull a card that's been out there 2 weeks and you run that card through your computer, well, you're trying to correlate that back 2 weeks ago. And you're correlating this instantly with the cell cameras. So what I found, that's why we talked about, the first south after a north wind. All my cameras are lit up after a front moves through, and it's the first south after north, and from experience, a lot of the bucks I've killed, that's happened. But you can see before the front, I've often thought this and listening to people, but man, watch your cameras. It may be 3 hours before you can even tell the front's coming in. All of a sudden, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you're getting deer on your camera. And then the next thing you know, 2 hours later, this big storm comes through or whatever. And you can tell it with your animals or whatever. People always talk about, well, I drive by, why is all the cows feeding at this time? But I can drive by 5 different farms and all the cows are laying down bedded. There's something to all that. And then, especially after a weather front, me and a buddy was hunting a very big deer several years ago, and we're talking 200-inch class buck, and it was a mature deer. And we were planning on moving in. We was getting this deer on camera, and we were planning on cell camera. We was planning on moving in his bedding area on 2 different spots, because he was traveling out. He had 2 different circuits. One day he would go out this way, one day he would go out this way. So he was going to set up on one, I was going to set up on another. And we're sitting there waiting on the rain to quit. It's pouring down the rain. It's raining cats and dogs. Waiting on the rain to quit. I got out there to his house. We got all of our stuff. We were sitting there in a truck getting ready to tear off out through the brush. We was waiting on it to quit. The rain quit. Got out of the truck. Was getting our backpacks and stands on. Phone went off. The thing's standing there in a scrape. And I'm like, what? As soon as that rain quit, he must have just stood right up, shook off, and went down to that scrape. And we just threw up our hands thinking, okay, he's here. We can't go in there and hunt where we wanted to hunt, so we hunted way back and never seen him. But if we didn't have that camera, we'd have never known that, and we'd have went in there and blew him out.
Yeah.
So it's pretty cool.
One thing, you're 100% correct. The correlation with data in real time with cell cameras, it changes in the way that you're analyzing your pictures. And I first noticed that probably more than anything last year in the late season with wind speed. Wind speed, when we were watching some of those cameras on food sources last year, we would have deer would show up on food, as they do in the late season, double-digit wind speeds. Winds are ripping. Nothing is happening. Cameras are quiet. That wind speed drops to 7, 8, 9, maybe 10 miles an hour, where it was in the high teens or low 20s. It's like a light switch. So you're back on food. So there's a lot of things you can learn from that real-time information on cell cameras. we talk about trail cameras all the time. Obviously, they change how people have hunted, and they're probably one of the most powerful tools in a hunter's arsenal. But I've said this on the record once before: cell cameras are it's the biggest technological advancement or advantage a whitetail hunter has put in his arsenal since the modern day firearm.
I agree.
I mean,
Yes, I agree.
It's
Bold statement, but it's true.
Yes, I agree.
yeah. There's no way
I
around
agree.
it.
At times, I think, I'd like to throw all these cameras back out like it was in the 80s and 90s, just because a lot of people are hunting behind their houses when they never did before, because they go back there and throw out a bag of corn in Ohio, put a camera up on it, and they get this huge buck. They would have went back there hunting 10 times and never seen the thing.
Right.
But now they know he's back there, so they're hunting all the time. And then you can't get permission to hunt that because little Johnny's got a picture of a giant back there. So, I hunted a lot before trail cameras came out, and I bought one of the very first trail cameras that came out, and I actually had what they call trail timers, to where you strung a string across, put them things on. I thought I had to have one of them, so I put this thing up, and I found out that later it didn't help me much. I mean, because who knows what was tripping the wire going through. And then they come out with it's called a cam tracker. And the thing, and I can't remember when it was, it had to be in the early 90s. It had a 35 millimeter camera that you set down inside of this casing, and it had a sensor on it. And I would set this thing up and over apples and different things like that and get these pictures. It was just amazing. And then I had problems of finding out that I would watch a deer walk in front of it and never took its picture. But I never realized that cameras, a lot of the sensors picked up not only motion but heat. And then you would take that. I would have a 24 roll of film in it. It would have 10 pictures on it. Well, I'd rip it out and run to Rite Aid or whatever to a pharmacy and get them developed. And then I'd get back a couple coons and 3 or 4 does. Yeah. It was just horrible, but it was neat. It was something I never realized that at the time it would turn into what it is today. I mean, you would have to be, especially if you're hunting a large bucks, you'd have to be crazy not to use cameras. I mean,
it's.
I know Cody talks about, well, I'm not using cameras. Well, he hunts a little bit differently, and he knows there's good quality of deer on his farms. I may have 6, 7 different farms, and I run cameras on it to let me know if there's any good deer on it. And in Ohio, you can bait, so I love throwing out a camera in an area, sprinkling out a little bit of corn in front of it, and I'm usually going to get every deer on that place or whatever. But still, what I've learned is just because you run a camera in there, you still need to scout, because some of these things pick up on them cameras, especially where you place them, what kind of camera you have. I mean, you got to be careful. You just can't buy a Tasco from Walmart, take it out there and set it up and think you're doing good. You got to be strategic about it and use good quality trail cameras.
It's trail cameras are a funny thing, and we won't go down this rabbit hole, but we talk a lot about the education process, the technical side of these things, and digital trail cameras have been around since 2001, early 2000s, 2000, 2001. Just after those 35 millimeter days, but so they've been around for 20 years, right?
Yep.
And people, I'm gonna say a large number of people, the majority are still clueless on how they work. The terminology behind recovery times, shutter or trigger speeds, the megapixel thing. There's just a lot of misconceptions or bad information that was put out in the early 2000s that people still believe is true today. So it's an ongoing battle for us, trying to help educate people on how these things work and how you can use them to your advantage. But then also, if you're using them in the wrong manner or the wrong way, they're going to cause you more harm than they are good.
Absolutely.
So I apologize if there's a weird cut or edit in this. We actually lost power. Batteries died in our H6. So I had to run out the truck, grab another set of batteries. But Heath, we've been here for the better part of almost 3 hours, or over 3 hours. We were here at 8 o'clock this morning, so we don't want to take too much more of your time up. We have some other errands and things we have to get done today as well while we're in the area. So it was a pleasure to sit down with you, as always. As we were walking outside, Cameron mentioned, he's like, man, I love being around this guy. He's enthusiastic, his energy. He's like, I can sit here and talk all day. So It's been a pleasure as always. If anybody wants to follow you or anything that you're doing with Cody and Lone Wolf Custom Gear,
Sure.
where are you gonna send them?
So you can find me on Facebook, just Heath Cisco, same way on Instagram, and then look for our stuff on Lone Wolf Custom Gear and Whitetail Addictions. We have a YouTube page, Lone Wolf Custom Gear, and I work with Justin Hollingsworth on Whitetail Addictions and Byron Horton. So we're always doing stuff with it. We're preparing for season this fall, and hopefully we're going to have a lot more episodes coming, later on next spring and in the summer. So I appreciate you guys coming. It's been great. I love talking deer. Any time I can sit down and talk with some guys like you, it's just great. And I appreciate it. Hopefully somebody can take something out of this podcast and build on it. Just don't take everything I say as gospel, but take some of the things that we talked about and build off of those and use them to your advantage. And just if it doesn't work for you, then don't do it.
I think that's probably some of the best advice. Anybody could give another hunter. So,
sure.
For anyone tuning in, we appreciate all the ears, the eyeballs on YouTube. This podcast has been growing like crazy, as well as the YouTube channel. So, just want to say a quick thank you for all the support. It does not go unnoticed. So, good luck to everyone this year. If you have any questions or something specific maybe you want to ask Heath, leave them in the comments section below on this video. Leave us a thumbs up, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, guys.